From 1900 to 1950, women made significant advancements in civil rights legislation and aided tremendously in both world wars. During the early 20th century, a significant focus for American women was the passage of the 19th Amendment. Alice Paul, a prominent suffragist activist, formed the National Women's Party, which organized public demonstrations and protests. For nearly 2.5 years, 6 days a week, NWP members picketed in front of the White House to gain national attention and communicate their wants to President Lyndon B. Johnson. This group was also responsible for creating the suffragist flag, which featured large purple and gold stripes and 36 purple and gold stars. Once each state agreed to ratify the 19th Amendment, the group would sew a new star onto the flag. As attention for NWP's demonstrations grew, many of the members were arrested for obstructing traffic, which only increased the NWP's fury and pulled the group's focus toward lobbying for the release of protesters. Alternately, Ida B. Wells, both a journalist and a prominent leader of the civil rights movement, called specifically for the abolishment of lynching. She called it a blight upon our nation and claimed it was mocking our laws and disgracing our Christianity. Wells calls upon Congress to help solve this problem, similar to the women of the suffrage movement, showing how a large percentage of women of this time were looking to create permanent and lasting change through congressional legislation. Finally, women played a significant role in both World War I and World War II. During World War I, women began taking on the responsibilities traditionally given to men. This allowed for more soldiers to serve, as they weren't tied to factory jobs back home. Although this shifted traditional female roles, many still believed that the woman's place was in the home, and organizations that employed women during this time made sure that they weren't, quote, masculinized by factory jobs. On the other hand, certain newspapers, especially those published by women, urged American women to join the war effort and depicted wartime women as unquestionably feminine. During World War II, while some continued their work at home, women began to involve themselves more and more militarily. This came after President Eisenhower stated that he felt as though he could not win the war without aid from the American women. Hundreds of thousands volunteered for organizations such as the Women's Army Corps, the Army Nurses Corps, and the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, while some served as lab technicians or tested newly built planes. But the duality of the perception of women during this time remained fairly consistent to World War I. While some posters plastered the image of Mighty Rose the Riveter, others called for women ordnance workers, or WOWs, to fill the spot of the man that, quote, left her behind. Unfortunately, in the end, the failure to acknowledge the efforts made by women meant many were forced out of their jobs by returning male soldiers, and made it so women had difficulty accessing the benefits laid out in the GI Bill.
All the leaves are brown, and the sky is gray, and the sky is gray.
For centuries, women have been underrepresented in the government and pushed down by the hand of power. In different eras, this power has looked different. In the 1950s, throughout the 1970s, this power was seen through things such as restrictions on bodily autonomy, rape, and economic dependence, just to name a few. But during this period, there began to be revelations and protests to this power. In the years in between this era of feminism in the 60s and 70s and prior movements in the early 20th century, there has been a lot of discourse over whether women were relishing in the so-called domesticity of the 1950s, leaving feminist movements somewhat stagnant, or whether they were continuing to fight. And while the 1950s was not the most revolutionary period for feminism, the years leading up to another wave of feminism are just as important as the peaks of the movement, because the oppression in the so-called stagnant eras is often what manifests to be the goals of the next period or wave of feminism. So the domestic, suburban, middle-class, housewife, stay-at-home mom stereotype of the 1950s reveals a lot about what women were valued for and how that contributed to the goals of feminism in the 1960s and 70s. And we also shouldn't overlook the women who were still fighting during the 1950s. The middle-class, suburban, domestic housewife stereotype did not apply to working-class women or a lot of women of color who were still fighting for the cause and fighting for their rights. So although the 50s were not necessarily a period of increased rights or increased feminist legislation, they most certainly cannot be regarded as stagnant years by any means, because that would blatantly leave out the struggles and the courage of, like I said, many working class women and women of color. And as I said prior, most of the goals of The feminist movements in the 60s and 70s were direct reactions toward the prevailing stereotypes and social responsibilities of women in the decade prior, in the 1950s. So things such as abortion rights directly challenged that stay-at-home mom stereotype. With the Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade, women were granted greater access to abortion nationally, and the right to an abortion was ruled to be protected constitutionally under the 14th Amendment, specifically the right to privacy clause, as well as under numerous other amendments for various other reasons. And this decision in this case offered a type of liberation and emancipation to women, specifically in their, with their own bodies and their choice to have children and give birth. That was partially freed from the control of the government and of legislators. And the word emancipation actually was a very prominent character in this movement, as seen in this image from a women's march in 1970 with the sign urging for women's emancipation. It is clear that women weren't just seeking greater comfort in society, but freedom from control and freedom from oppressive power. And other areas in which women were fighting for this freedom and this emancipation was in the workplace. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 not only guaranteed women the right to, of course, equal pay, but it also recognized that women and men could perform jobs of the same caliber, and therefore why they deserved equal pay. As said in the beginning, and restated again, the goals of this movement were manifestations of the oppression of the previous decade, and economic liberation offered by the Equal Pay Act was a sort of retaliation to that domestic, economically dependent stereotype of many suburban middle-class women in the 1950s. And of course, women were still, even in the 1960s and 70s, women were still becoming housewives and stay-at-home moms, and that is completely respectable work. But this act offered another direction that they could go. It emancipated them from that sole choice of that domestic lifestyle. And of course, for working class women, this offered greater economic security, and similar for women of color and anyone who didn't have access to that suburban middle class lifestyle. And finally, one power dynamic was the issue of rape. And rape has obviously been an issue for decades before this and is still an issue today. But in this decade, and in this wave of feminism specifically in the 60s and 70s, is when a lot of ideas began to shift about what rape really was. And Susan Brown Miller, who was a prominent activist and journalist during this time, and a prominent feminist, in an excerpt from her book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, as she's speaking about an article that she wrote prior to writing this book about a rape case, she says, "Although I conducted scores of interviews for that article, I did not seek out, nor did I attempt to speak with the victim. I felt no kinship with her, nor did I admit publicly or privately that what had happened to her could happen on any level to me. I had always considered myself a strong woman." And later, she continues to say how her mind was changed after a rape-centered conference. She says, "There, in a high school auditorium, I finally confronted my own fears, my own past, my own intellectual defenses. Something important and frightening to contemplate had been left out of my education, a way of looking at male-female relations, at sex, at strength, and at power. Never one to acknowledge my vulnerability, I found myself forced by my sisters in feminism to look it squarely in the eye. I wrote this book because I am a woman who had changed her mind about rape." And Brown Miller is a particularly good example of this shift in mindset because she considered herself to be a feminist and she was a very prominent activist, but she still acknowledges her ignorance to the true nature of rape and her various intellectual defenses that prevented her from seeing rape as a feminist issue. While of course there are many more prominent goals of this wave of feminism, these prior mentioned all show a shift in power and a type of emancipation, which was generally regarded as the theme of this wave of feminism as a whole.
of tie-dye, bell-bottoms, and hippies, feminism of the 70s was very much reflective of the time period. Mainstream feminism became a thing, as well as the introduction of the second wave of feminism. There were many important culture movements for the feminism movement, such as women getting Man of the Year in the 1976 edition of Times Magazine, as well as the significance of Gloria Steinem, who's a very important feminist.
I keep meeting women who I've heard all my life are bitchy and pushy and so on and so forth. I meet them and they're nice, compassionate people. It's if you don't play your role, you know, if you dare to aspire to something, then you get it automatically.
Who in the early 60s went undercover as a Playboy bunny and released a lot of awful practices that Playboy was doing at the time, such as some really horrific inside looks as to how men really objectified women, such as she was told that 24 was awfully old to be, and at this time Hugh Hefner was already 37, which shows the double standard that women were met with, that to them 24 was old, like 24 being a woman was old, but a man could just be 37 and do whatever he wanted. And the wage that women were being paid was nowhere near close to what they were promised, as they were promised around $1,000 a day in the contract and in the auditions, but ended up only being given $21 a day, and this is in modern money adjusted for inflation, and they even had their tips taken away. And this just shows a long time history of female objectification that would eventually carry out into later years and still be significant in further feminist movement. The era of Ronald Reagan, the death of John Lennon, and computers that looked like this, feminism in the 80s was starting to get more progressive. There was an organization called Women Against Pornography that sought to put legal restrictions on porn, as it was seen as really hurtful to feminism and female representation.
Well, I'll offer a legal definition, the same definition that the Civil Rights Anti-Pornography Ordinance offers: the graphic, sexually explicit subordination of women through pictures or words that also includes a number of elements ranging from dehumanizing women as sex objects to raping, mutilating, battering women. That accurately describes pornography, and that's the material we're referring to.
But this organization and movement was very divided, especially among other women, as they thought this branch off of the feminist movement would be seen as oppressive and also hurtful to women, not just help women be seen as less of objects. This era also brought with it a lot of amazing films that really pushed for women in the film industry, such as the film 9 to 5, which has Dolly Parton in it, which brings to light police sexual harassment in a kind of comedy way, but also really brought to light this discrimination that was happening in every aspect of society. And it also produced the really good song 9 to 5 by Dolly Parton.
9 to 5 for service and devotion. You would think that I would deserve a fair promotion.
And this was also the time when the Equal Rights Amendment failed to pass, which, thanks to Phyllis Schlafly, would have basically ensured equal rights regardless of sex, but because of people like Schlafly who went against the amendment, it ended up failing and is actually still trying to be passed today. This also brought with it a lot of arts movements, such as Guerrilla Girls, which really put a lot of pressure on especially the art world and artists to let women have just as much of a chance of being in an art gallery as men.
And out of close to 200 artists, fewer than 17 were women, and there were almost no artists of color. And it was a little annoying because the curator of the show said in the press, this was Kynaston McShine, that anyone who was not included in his show should rethink his career. And just his use of that pronoun, rethink his career, struck us. And we just pushed away at that. I think there was the general assumption at the time that if there were no women or artists of color in the mainstream art history books, it meant that their work did not rise to the quality necessary.
The 80s also brought with it a lot of big moves in music, such as Cyndi Lauper,
Oh, girls used to wanna have that love they really want.
Madonna,
Ooh, baby. Yeah, can't you hear my heartbeat?
Kate Bush, Janet Jackson, and Stevie Nicks.
Heavens when it's raining, yeah. Players only love you when they're playing.
So overall, in the 80s, most of the movements in terms of feminism were coming with a lot of power in female voices, and the way that women seem to be more likely to speak out and push the movement further. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, the cloning of Dolly the sheep, and mobile phones, this brings us to the 90s. Feminism in the 90s is mostly correlated to third wave feminism as well as Riot Girl.
The name came from a number of sources. Jen Smith used the words girl riot in a letter to Allison Wolfe when she was talking about the Mount Pleasant race riots. She was saying that women needed to have a similar riot. The girl part of the title was just as pointed. It came from the fact that these women remembered feeling most empowered as children, as girls, before they were forced to face the demands of society and the male gaze.
Which Riot Girl was a more aggressive turn to the feminist movement, and the 90s in general is often correlated with a more aggressive turn of this movement, as Liz Naylor, who would eventually become the manager of the Riot Girl band Huggy Bear, is quoted as saying, "There was a lot of anger and self-mutilation. In a symbolic sense, women were cutting and destroying the established image of femininity, aggressively tearing it down." So women at this point in time had seen all of these amendments and bills get not passed, and just increased more hurt towards women and discrimination. And this led to the new age of feminists of the 90s creating Riot Girl that would be a more aggressive way of pushing out their self-image. And around this time, birth control has been legal for a while, but it is not free under insurance. And women's insurance also costed more than men, even though things like birth control weren't counted under it. In this era, another thing that was really big, such as in the 80s, was the music, such as Sonic Youth's song Cool Thing.
I just want to know, what are you going to do for me? Are you going to liberate us girls?
The band No Doubt. Veruca Salt. Bikini Kill. And Alanis Morissette. The 90s also brought with it a lot of female firsts, such as the first female secretary, Madeleine Albright, and the first woman to complete the 7 summits, Junko Tabei. But even with all of these firsts for women, there was still so much female objectification and discrimination, such as seen with the disaster that was Woodstock 1999. And it really just shows how men continued to view women as objects and belittled them, and also how bigger people in the media, such as some of the bands playing at this festival, would publicly belittle women, even their fellow artists. And it just shows how even with all of these firsts and all of this progression in society, there are still people that will be discriminatory, and a lot of people won't push them down, and they'll be encouraged by the other people around them.
Without your soul, 9 million. I'm a survivor. I'm not gonna give up. I'm not gonna stop. I'm gonna work.
Feminism has changed a lot over time in the 21st century due to different acts, movements, and mediums that are able to get some different forms of feminist movements across. This is seen in 2016 in the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act and how it was reauthorized again in 2022. This is seen in 2016 in how it helped marginalized communities such as same-sex couples in the LGBTQ community and women that are Native Americans on reservations to be able to get legal counsel based on whatever happened to them and be able to get help trying to get legal recompense for whatever happened to them based on legal aid. This is also seen through how many laws were also made at this time to help in tandem with the Violence Against Women Act to help many women who've been sex trafficked to help them get legal help. This is seen also in 2022 and how it was reauthorized again to help more women. On the other side of feminism at this time, we see many women trying to protest and help women to try to get Roe v. Wade to not be overturned based on Justice Alito's draft proposal of the court of what will happen to Roe v. Wade if it is struck down. This repealing of Roe v. Wade based on what might happen if the justices do decide to vote this way in July is that many women would not be able to get an abortion based on the fact that many women in the South and in the Midwest, with the states' rights being able to choose that many women should have an abortion, that state will not be able to get access to an abortion. This would marginally hurt many women of color and poor women who could not afford to go to a different state to get an abortion. This is seen in tandem with many different feminist movements at this time, feminist movements and feminist mediums to help try to get many different, more of a feminist agenda across. This is seen through podcasts such as the Hysteria podcast, which argues many different feministic approaches to many different arguments. This is also seen through many movies that are targeted to young viewers like Legally Blonde.
You got into Harvard Law?
What, like it's hard?
Which helps many girls believe in themselves to be able to go into more male-dominated field areas like law, which like law used to be, which is seen through Elle Woods and how she became a lawyer, and how that inspires many young girls to do the same. This is also seen in tandem with Women in STEM movement and how it tries to advocate for women to go into more male-dominated STEM fields. Thank you for watching, and this is our presentation on basically feminist movements across time. I hope you guys enjoyed. All right, thank you.